Welcome to the Chess Angle. This is not your typical chess podcast. If you're an amateur or club-level player, the Chess Angle is for you. Our content is aimed at busy adults who are serious about the game but have limited study time. Featured guests include both amateur and titled players alike. And now, here's your host, Director of the Long Island Chess Club, Neil Bellon.
Welcome, everybody. Shout out to our sponsor, Chessable. Their courses are awesome. I know many of you are already using Chessable, but if you haven't, you definitely should check them out. There is a link, as always, in the show notes for Chessable's main page, as well as a link to our landing page where there's a list of some of my favorite courses. Now, this episode is going to be a little different. It's the first one I'm doing on location. All right, because of my schedule, I wasn't able to record using my home setup, so I'm trying this. So the audio might not be as good as it usually is, but I think it's okay. I mean, if it's that bad, I wouldn't have posted it. So the fact that you're listening to it means that I felt it was passable enough. But we're going to check this out. So we're on location. This will be a solo episode. Now, before we get into the main topic and the main subject matter of this episode, I just want to share some prefacing remarks just about my experiences as an amateur player. Couple of things interesting, I think. First is that on chess.com, like when I play online, which is not that often, I feel like nobody wants to play with a delay or the increment, right? Anybody? Bueller? Like nobody wants to play with an increment. So I'm playing a lot of 5-0 games, just 5 minutes with no delay. Because if I put in a 5-minute game with a 5-second delay, which is my favorite, I can't get anybody to bite. A lot of players will do 3-2, 3 minutes with a 2-second increment, but that's a little fast for me. I kind of prefer 5-5, but nobody wants to seem to do it. And I do enjoy playing with the delay. I think it's a better way to go. But I don't know if you're experiencing that or not, but it just seems like everybody wants to do these 5-0 games or, maybe 3-2 at the most for an increment. I don't know. Maybe it was just these past few times I logged on. Maybe it was a fluke, but that's something I've been experiencing. Next thing I want to talk about is just a general statement for adult improvers, even if you started late. Now, when you start to play chess competitively, quote unquote, late, that means different things to different people. Like for a lot of titled players, if you start, let's say after the age of 15, they'll consider that late. But I think for most of us, we consider late, I guess, age 25 and beyond or something. But I just want to make a few comments about that. You can improve as an adult, even if you started late. Don't let anyone tell you that your improvement's going to be limited. Now, as far as becoming a titled player, that's a different story. But as far as reaching something like 1700 or 1800 or 2000, you can totally do that if you're organized and you put the work in and you have the right mindset. And I don't believe you need to study for several hours a day in order to make leaps and bounds in your improvement. Now, for me, and I spoke about this a little bit, I started in my 20s playing like competitively and seriously. Like I started playing around 6th, 7th grade. That's when I learned like how the pieces move. And I used to play in school when we had library as a class during the day, or study hall, I should say. For study hall, we were able to go to the library and chess was the only game that was available. So I would play at school every day, but I didn't really become a serious player as far as understanding more than just how the pieces move and strategy until my 20s. And I didn't play in my first tournament until my 20s. And I was around 1,000, 1,100, worked my way up after a number of years to the high 1800s. I was almost 1900, but now I'm going through some variants. I'm like swinging back and forth. I was in the 1700s for a while. Right now, because I'm transparent about this stuff, I'm like high 1600s right now. I mean, my rating took about a 200-point hit. I'll get it back, but that type of variance, this brings me to my next point, that type of variance and those sort of swings in your rating, those are completely normal at the amateur level. I mean, pretty much everyone goes through that. And the swings can be wild. Like I said, I'm in about a 200-point dip. I went down even lower. I dipped down to my floor at 1600, swung all the way back up to like 1730, and now I'm back in the high 1600s again due to some bad outings. I'll get it back. I'm not worried about that, but those types of swings are normal. So if you're going through that, that's just part of the process. You're going to have peaks and valleys. And my current goal, I had announced this, was to get back over 1800 where I was by December of this year, 2022. I don't think that's going to happen, if I'm being honest, but that's okay. That's okay. You know, these things happen. So unless my next two tournaments are like pristine, unless I have like amazing results, I don't think it's going to happen. But that's okay. I'll get there. And I know there's a lot going on with me right now. And I've also taken breaks over the years as well. Even though I started playing when I was in my 20s, that includes, you know, some breaks where I didn't play. There were some years I didn't play. That's normal. People take breaks. Life happens. So we all go through it. We all go through it. But the point I'm trying to make is that you absolutely can improve as an adult, even if you started late. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And as far as playing in tournaments, I've said this before, you're never really quote unquote ready for tournament play. Just jump in. There's no right time. We actually have a lot of adult beginners at the club right now, the Long Island Chess Club. So it's a big mix. For example, we have 2,100 players. We have 2,200 players, masters, and we have adult beginners. So it's a big mix. So, I mean, again, we have masters, and then, you know, we have players who are still struggling with some of the basic rules. And that's not a criticism because, you know, they're just starting out. Like there was one player last week, he didn't realize that you can't castle through check. I think most of you know that. Those of you who may be beginners, if there's space between your king and rook and you want to castle, if your opponent is attacking one of the empty squares that your king has to go across, you can't castle, right? So you can't castle through check, so to speak. We had one player who didn't know that. You know, and these things happen. And the point I'm trying to make is that we have a wide range of players, and the best way is to just jump in. Because some people think, well, I don't want to start playing in tournaments until I know I'm going to do well. I want to wait and I want to study. And then when I enter my first tournament, I'll do really well. It doesn't really work that way because you kind of have to take your lumps and you have to get used to tournament conditions and using a clock and writing the moves down and dealing with nerves and things. That type of stuff doesn't really happen just from studying. So you're better off just jumping right in. You'll probably get a lot of losses right away, but that's part of the deal. Now, you may have heard of some players, because I know what you're going to say. Well, I know a guy, you know, he started playing in tournaments and, you know, he was like 1,800 6 months after playing. Those are outliers. Now, there's two things. Number one, there's always going to be outliers. There's always going to be exceptions that prove the rule. And number two, some of these players may have a lot of playing experience outside of tournaments. All right. So it's kind of a different thing for everybody. But most players, when they first get into tournaments, if they're an adult improver, they're going to have a lot of losses at first. That's normal. And you just need to hang in there. All right. But interesting story about a beginner not knowing the rules. I'm just going to kind of throw this in there because it's funny. We all know, or most of you know, the en passant rule. It's a special pawn move. En passant, of course, means in passing in French, where if an opponent moves his pawn 2 squares and you have a pawn adjacent, you can capture in front of it. A lot of players don't know about that. And this was many years ago. I don't know why I just thought of this story, but I'm going to share it because it's kind of funny. So this is at least 10 years ago. And we had a beginner, or like a somewhat like a semi-beginner. He was maybe approaching intermediate level. He never heard of en passant, and his opponent did it. And he thought it was, you know, he was making it up. He's like, there's no such thing. So we had to convince him. It was like a whole ordeal, but it was kind of funny because he thought his opponent was cheating because he didn't realize the en passant move. So these are things that happen. So just some general thoughts about being an adult improver, about playing in tournaments. Now, some other things about chess improvement, because you see these comments online or you'll hear people say them. And this is something that I kind of want to point out and share my thoughts on because I think it's important. You need to study all phases of the game regardless of your level, because there's this pervasive thinking that, well, if you're this level, you should be studying this. If you're a beginner, you should be studying this. If you're 1200, you should be studying this. If you're 1400, you should be studying this, and et cetera, et cetera. I don't agree with that. You should be studying all phases of the game, regardless of your level. Now, yes, as a beginner, you do need to focus on not making gross blunders, not hanging pieces, and basic tactical themes, of course. But you still need to study all phases of the game. All right? And this is something I go back to international master Jeremy Silman. I know I mention him a lot, but I just think he's really in tune to what amateurs go through. And his whole thing, and I agree, is that even for beginners, you do need to start to feed them some more advanced concepts as well. But I go back to what I said earlier, the myth about that, you should only study certain phases of the game depending on what your rating is. Like a big one that I think is wrong is, don't study openings until you're 1600, or don't study openings until you're 1800. That's moronic in my view. You need to study openings, whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or an advanced player, you need to study openings. You have to have some opening background. All right, so the idea that you should wait until you're, 1800 or whatever it is, that makes no sense, right? The other thing that's a little bit moronic, if I'm being honest, is, well, until you're about 1800 or 2000, your first name should be tactics, your middle name should be tactics, and your last name should be tactics. Yes, tactics are important, of course, and they should be a regular part of your study, but you can't focus just on tactics until you're 1800. You do need to study middle game concepts. You do need to study end game concepts, right? Like the opposition and king and pawn versus king, all that stuff. So I don't like these labels. You need to study all aspects of the game regardless of your rating level. Now, the intensity with which you do that is going to vary. Obviously, if you're a beginner, you need to study openings to the point that you're comfortable and you're getting a playable middle game. You're not going to study openings the way, let's say, a 2200 player would, where you're getting into like all sorts of variations in the latest theory, right? Obviously, if you're just starting out, I mean, this is true for all players really, but especially in the beginning, the purpose of the opening is to get a playable middle game. You want to get to the middle game and you want to be equal, slightly better, or much better. That's your goal. I mean, even if you're an advanced player, that should be your goal. But especially when you're starting out, you don't need to go down like all these rabbit holes and study all these crazy variations. So as far as not studying openings, until you're 1800, I mean, that part of it, I guess, right? As far as going down all these crazy lines, but you can't ignore opening study just because you're a beginner. All right. Yes. Emphasize your, avoiding gross blunders, not hanging pieces, all that stuff, of course. But you do need to study all aspects of the game, regardless of your rating level. That's just my opinion. I know people are going to agree with me. Some are going to disagree. But I don't like these labels. Like, okay, if you're 1200, study this. If you're 1400, study this. Maybe to a certain degree, but in a lot of the discourse, I think some of that stuff is a little too exaggerated. Focus on your weaknesses, but you do have to cover all aspects of the game. So I just wanted to share that because I do have some strong opinions on that, just throwing it out there. So now let's get to the main topic of this episode, which is about being too literal at the chessboard. And I'll give some examples and explain what I mean by that. And this is where your thinking is too inside the box. You're too much of a rule follower at the chessboard. Now, I'm not talking about the rules of chess. Obviously, like if you're in check, you have to get out of check. When I say rule follower, I mean where you stick to the quote unquote correct chess principles a little too literally. And if I'm being honest, this is something I struggle with myself. I actually like very straightforward games. I like going into an endgame. I can certainly be tactical if I need to, but I do enjoy a more positional style. I actually like those boring games where it's slow and strategic. Other people disagree, but I just have that kind of positional style. That's just my kind of chess. Like for me, give me an ending where I'm a pawn up, or maybe I have a slight edge, or I can squeeze out a slow win with technique. I'll take that over like some crazy swashbuckling tactical line any day of the week. But as far as liking a more positional game and not getting into crazy tactics, you can actually take that too far and you miss opportunities as a result. So let's talk about this. Now, first, I want to take a step back and add something to last week's discussion about using a chess engine, because it actually ties into this episode about being too literal. And this happens whenever you do a podcast. You'll record an episode, no matter how organized you are or how many notes you take. There's always that, oh, I should have said this. I mean, everybody goes through that, right? Or I should have said that. So, and here's what it is. With using a chess engine, there's often many good choices beyond the top engine choices, especially in dry or even positions. So in other words, if you didn't play one of the top 4 or 5 engine moves, don't think like, oh, it's a bad move or that I failed. Like, for example, if it's a very dry or even position, you'll notice that the top engine choices all lead to an equal position. There's simply no way, that a move could have been made to gain an advantage. But you might think, oh, okay, my move wasn't one of the top engine choices, so it was a bad move. No. And very often in those even positions, you'll put the move that you played in and it'll still be equal. I mean, there might be 7, 8 or more good moves in one position. Now, obviously, if the engine shows that you had a mate or you could have won a piece, obviously your move wasn't good. But I'm talking about those positions where it's kind of even. There's often a lot of choice. So don't think like you have to match the engine choice. And that's an example of not being literal when you use the chess engine. You have to use it as a tool. So let's give some specific examples of being too literal or where you're sticking to principles too rigidly. One example would be to dismiss moving the same piece twice in the opening when it might actually be a good move. Because that's a principle. Don't move the same piece twice in the opening. But there are many times where moving the same piece twice is not only correct, but it might actually be the best move. It might give you some type of advantage. It might win a piece or a pawn or be a tactical thing. So you need to be aware of that. The other thing is, it's wrong to dismiss your preparation or play an off-book idea if it makes sense. And that's, what we do sometimes. We prep something and we stick to it so rigidly that we miss another opportunity that would have been better. All right. And I spoke about this with, Brian Caron when I interviewed him a while back, which is that, even though you prep, you still got to play chess and you still need to be flexible and really be attuned to the specific position at hand. Like, let me give an example of a game I played where my opponent played the English opening, where it was C4. There was a piece exchange I could have done. I won't get into specific details because we're audio only, but just as a general idea, there was a trade I could have made that's not typical in this opening, but it would have given me another advantage. But because I didn't really prep for it, I kind of dismissed it, even though I saw on the board that it would have worked. All right, so it was an off-book idea, and putting it in the engine afterward, it actually was very good. But I simply dismissed it. Why? Because I was too literal. I was relying on my prep too much, and I could have tried this other idea, but I didn't. And because it was an off-book idea, it might have thrown my opponent off as well. So that was an example of me being too rigid. Now, Jared Tavares, who I spoke with a few episodes back last season, Jared plays very non-conventionally, and we spoke about playing off-book moves and throwing off your opponent. And Jared made a fantastic point, which is that it's these non-literal moves, it's these sort of offbeat moves that often are the winning tactical shots. So in other words, a lot of moves you make that win a piece or win a pawn or give an advantage in some way, go against conventional thinking. And that's why a lot of players miss them. For example, there might be a winning move that requires you to move a pawn in front of your castled king. But because every book we read says, don't move your castling pawns, right? We miss that opportunity. Or it might say, don't move a knight to the edge of the board, knight's on the rim or dim, but yet moving that knight to the edge of the board might win a piece or something like that. And I think what Jared said is very, very true. Very often the winning moves are the type of moves that go against conventional thinking. Maybe it involves, moving the same piece twice in the opening. But if we're so rigid and fixed with quote unquote chess principles and we don't see the exceptions, you're going to miss opportunities. Something else that ties into this is the idea of positional literalness versus getting an initiative or other advantage. What I mean by that is you're so afraid to violate a positional idea or a positional structure, and you end up missing an opportunity as a result. So in other words, you miss an initiative or a tactical idea because you're worried about a positional thing. For example, if I play this move, I'm going to then get a backward pawn, so I'm not going to play it. Or if I play this move, I'm giving up the two bishops. Or if I play this move, I'm going to have doubled pawns. But what you don't realize is that even though you're making that positional concession, you're then getting, let's say, a winning attack. Or you're then getting a rook on an open file. Or you're getting some other idea that's winning. So in conclusion, you don't want to let general principles, quote unquote, hinder you from playing these creative moves and these winning moves, because very often violating them is often the correct idea. They're really guidelines. You shouldn't really call them rules. They're guidelines, things like don't move the same piece twice in the opening, because many times it is correct to violate those ideas. And I spoke with Jared Tavares in the previous episode. This was going back to last season, a previous episode. We spoke about that at length. And I just want to repeat what I said earlier because Jared made such a good point. Those moves that go against conventional thinking are often the winning tactical ideas. Like very often when you see a winning tactical shot, it looks like it goes against, a typical quote unquote principle. So you have to be aware of them. You have to spot them. It comes with experience. But if you're too rigid and fixed in your thinking, you're going to miss these opportunities, which I'll argue happens quite often in amateur games because they're so mistake prone that these opportunities arise. I mean, of course, this type of thinking is true at higher levels as well, but I think it's especially true at the club level. So these are some ideas I wanted to share just about thinking outside the box, about being flexible, about not letting your prep sort of cloud your thinking and not letting it miss these types of opportunities. Just wanted to throw that out there. Really appreciate you listening. All of our links are in the show notes. And as always, I hope you win your next game. Have a great day, everybody.